Melissa Roman, and I'm excited to be speaking to you today about design systems at scale. I'm also excited to be speaking at the pre-conference because this is a lot less intimidating than talking to 1,000 developers. I apologize, I got sick. Well, it's not my fault, but I got sick a couple days ago, so I'm a little bit stuffed up. I'll try to avoid sneezing and coughing at you. So that's me. I've been a developer at Ticketfly in San Francisco and working with Ember for about 1.5 years. You can find me at those handles, although I think I've tweeted maybe twice in my life, so it's not the most exciting feed to follow. So why do we even want a design system? Why am I speaking to you today? A lot of the kind of similar problems come up with different companies that cause someone to want to implement a design system. So first, varying implementation of similar components throughout your apps and products. This means more work for engineers, less consistency across products and different components. That also means that UI engineers aren't able to reuse code. So everyone's creating their own components and, again, less consistency, more work. And there's more risk that the components aren't going to be up to date with current designs. So I'm going to start off with some basic terminology just so we're all on the same page. People use different terms that kind of have overlapping meaning and context. So I want to define how I'll be using style guide, pattern library, and design system. These aren't absolute definitions, but they're fairly well agreed on and how I'm going to be proceeding. So starting with style guide. This is your branding guidelines, your editorial tone, color palettes, all that stuff without data. So this is what directly influences the look and feel of your pattern library. That brings us to pattern library. So here you've got your static UI elements, common web layouts. This is ultimately what the developers are going to be using. And then the design system itself encompasses both of those previous, so the style guide and the pattern library, and then all the iteration and communication between everyone involved. So it's basically the entire process. So as with anything, it's important to figure out what your company's, your team's goals are when you're implementing something like this, so that everyone's building this with the same key goals in mind. At Ticketfly, we actually had several conversations that kind of came back to what our priorities were and what our key goals were, so that we were making sure we were building toward the same things. And since you're here listening to my talk, I'm going to give you my recommendations for what your goals should be. I'm going to walk you through a process that'll help keep your design system current and compatible with all your existing product features, as well as allow for smooth upgrades now and into the future. So regardless of if you're brand new to programming or if you've been coding and using designs for years, I'm going to show you how to implement and manage a working design system. So one of the first goals we want to have is to create. So we want to enable engineers to create consistent products out of the box using the comprehensive shareable components that you've created. We want to enable engineers to move fast through code reuse, collaboration, and beautiful documentation. We want to allow for smooth upgrades and then a lot of support and communication around those upgrades. And possibly most importantly, we want to be able to scale. So we want this design system to be set up to scale both to current projects, teams, and consumers, and then whatever we may see into the future. It really just needs to work. So however big or small your team starts at now, you want to have this in mind so that your system's set up to scale. So issues that come up, both within Ticketfly and working with our design system, and then also talking with some other companies, there were a lot of common things that came up time and time again, so some different obstacles. One of the biggest things that companies struggle with is actually getting support to really build something like this. So it does take engineer work and therefore time, so getting management to be on board with understanding the importance of building a design system is kind of the first obstacle. Then once you have that in place, figuring out best ways to distribute and communicate about this, and really how to make this a part of the culture. So there are plenty of other companies out there building design systems, and you often see the end product. So one of the most well-known ones is Google's material design. But not a lot of us know kind of the process that goes into it. So we have this product, but how did they come up with it? I actually spoke with people from each of these companies about different processes, documentation, obstacles they ran into, things they would have done differently. It was actually a really good learning experience. Even more companies have started a design system, but if it's in place and current, that's really a big obstacle for them. So many companies start something, but it's not documented or distributed properly. There's not really a system in place to have that, to have all the communication avenues there, and it quickly goes extinct. So the real test is if a design system is still in place and current 6 months, a year, 2 years after it started. So ask me next year at EmberConf how Ticketfly UI is doing. So the product. So everyone wants a great pattern library, and it sounds pretty easy. You just code up some generic components, make sure all the teams know where the repo is, and do it quickly because it's not actual product work, right? Well, not so much, not if you want something that actually works. What everyone really needs to understand is that the pattern library is your product, and that the consumers are the entire company, specifically the engineers who are going to be using this. So just like actual product work, there needs to be an iterative process to create, implement, release, and version all features, and this involves designers, developers, and documentation every step of the way. So you may be thinking these sound a lot like soft skill problems, and you're right, especially on within a smaller company or a smaller team, where you don't have the typical soft skill support as a regular product team. You need to keep that in mind because we're often our own PMs, sales team, support team, as well as the engineers. Another issue that came up was keeping all the things in sync. So we need our JavaScript and CSS to be in sync for all major versions so that we don't have conflicting styles within our components. So for example, if Ticketfly CSS is at version 2.0.4, we just need to make sure that all of our JavaScript components are also at version 2 point something. So this falls kind of hand in hand with just having strict adherence to semantic versioning, which we're probably all familiar with. But it just needs to be clear that to everyone who's using this, that if major versions are out of sync, then things are going to break. So again, communication with that as well. The pure dependency trap, which I'll actually go into a little bit more in detail later, but basically, if you can avoid having modules that are dependent on each other, then that helps decouple things and make things better. Distributing. So how do we actually get these components into the hands of our developers in a simple, seamless manner? Possibly easier for smaller teams or companies where you're just sitting all next to each other, but thinking about scaling this and making sure all teams at a bigger company can use these, those issues need to be considered. Communicating. So how can we communicate knowledge, announcements, changes, upgrades, migration paths, all that stuff to the organization at large? We really want to empower teams to deliver simple, accessible, consistent experiences to all our users. And then policing. So this is something we ideally don't really want to have to do. The more a company is spending on policing different things, the less they're really focusing on building a great system. And also the less teams are going to want to use this if they're being hounded about what they're using and what version they're on all the time. So we want to make this UI development as most self-service as we can. All right, so just to kind of recap our issues, so really recognizing that the library is the product that you're building, keeping everything in sync and trying to avoid peer dependencies, and then distributing, communication, and policing. All right, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about Ticketfly UI and things that went well, things that we kind of ran into, some other ideas that came up as we were working on this. Ticketfly UI is our design system within Ticketfly. So like many companies, we have several apps, and they all had varying implementations of these very similar components. We also had attempted something, trying to build a pattern library a few years ago, but it wasn't really well organized. We didn't have a ton of support around it, so it quickly just kind of got out of date and wasn't maintained well. So last fall, some of the front-end developers and designers came together and we wanted to do something about this. We wanted a pattern library that could really be used across the company to maintain all our standards and consistency in our styles throughout our apps. So we luckily had a lot of support from management. They understood the importance of building something like this. So with that support, we were able to form a small team of developers who was focusing on this project. So our basic process here was from design to developers to the users. Our end users are the teams, the engineers who are using this pattern library. So sometimes you can't do this feature by feature. As with Ticketfly, design had already come up with a bunch of designs for different components. So in an ideal world, we would probably sit together feature by feature and go through that. But in our case, we kind of looked at which were the most important components to start with. So which components were used across most of our apps, we really wanted to focus on those. We also wanted to start small and simple and with the more basic components. So we sat down with designers and went through all our sketch files, absolved any questions, figured out any outline cases that we might need, and really hammered things out with them. We decided to save things like animations and more complicated things until down the road. We had a really good understanding both across management, design, and engineering that there wasn't really an end goal of finishing the pattern library. So we were making it to make it easier for designers and developers to iterate on a product and on different features. But this end goal, it was really just to have an up-to-date, consistently maintained and consistently used pattern library. So something that would keep going. There's not like a hard stop on that. It was also critical to get a good understanding, especially from management and higher up, that this wasn't something that was going to return results overnight, that it was really a long-term investment. So the next thing we did was we actually brought pattern library stories into our product sprints. So we didn't have a dedicated team that was focused solely on Ticketfly UI. We had other projects that we were working on. So bringing these stories into our sprints really helped in two ways. So one, it made us accountable for actually working on Ticketfly UI during regular sprint work. So we would allot a certain amount of time to that. And then also it made it more of a bigger part of the culture. So our PMs knew about it, the backend engineers. So it just became more of a common standard across the company. Migrations. So ideally, you really want these to be easy and iterative. So whatever you're currently using, you want teams to be able to use the new system or upgrade things easily. A few months into building our system, we actually realized that we probably could have gone about it a little bit differently and had an easier migration path. We had kind of started with just building this new product that we were excited about, and we had it architected how we thought would work best. Sorry. And so that's fine, but in hindsight, we were thinking, well, if we had started with what we are currently using, which was a system based on Foundation, which if you're not familiar with, it's like Bootstrap, and then we could have just kind of added and removed custom components as we went, and then eventually added and removed all the CSS using something like Ember CSS modules. So in hindsight, that might have been something we were going to do. We already started down this new path of a new product. But just something to think about when you are starting this, you want developers to be able to migrate to your new system as easily as possible. So it might feel really great to build something from the ground up, but if no one's using it, then it's not that exciting. So to start building, we broke things into two main groups. So we have our foundations and our components. So the foundations are the smallest, most indivisible pieces of the library. So things like colors, spacing, typography and fonts, grid. And then our components, as you can see, are patterns that are built from multiple foundational elements. So for Ticketfly, we've got like our buttons, menus and drop-downs, selection controls, fields and forms, dialogues, toasts, etc. So here's a list just of what we have at Ticketfly. This would obviously vary per company and vary depending on what kind of components you need in your apps. But kind of you can see the basic structure of how we broke this apart. So here we've got basically all of our Ticketfly CSS as our foundations and then the different components, which our JavaScript pieces. All right, so let's talk about some best practices. Naming consistency. So this came up early on when we were developing Ticketfly UI. Do you call something a modal or a dialogue? Is this an elevation or a drop shadow? Is that color gray or neutral? So the answer to those questions isn't necessarily what's important. It's just making sure that you're consistent. So across both teams and orgs. A lot of times developers and designers especially have different terms for the same concept. So if a designer is calling something gray and the developers are calling something neutral, then there's going to be confusion there with the design handoff and the development process. So whatever is agreed on, consistency is really important for all of the naming. Second problem we found pretty quickly was the scalability of our naming system and our sizes. So t-shirt sizing can be difficult, and it does work well for certain projects and for certain teams. But if you have something like this, and you need something between small and medium, sure, there's small, medium, or medium, small, but those get a little bit confusing, and there are only so many pieces you can go. So it's better to use a numeric scale, or if you want to avoid having decimals and fractions and even anything in between those, you can actually use the actual measurement or pixel sizes, and then you don't have to really worry about scaling. Another place we want consistency is naming around classes and attributes. So this is just an example of one of our Ticketfly button. So for all of our components, we have a TF prefix for that. So TF button, TF toast, TF dialog, whatever it may be. And then in our foundation styles, we have a few different classes. So we have our base settings. So that's like our font variables, typography variables. So you can see the TF color indigo 5. That's part of our base settings. And then we have utility classes. So that's the U prefix. So that's like sizing, display, positioning. So you can see U with 50, U vertical, align middle. And then we have our garnish classes. So that's the G prefix. So that's like cursor style, font weight. So G font bold. And then we actually also have an O prefix for our object patterns, and that's just our grid. So that's not shown up here. So whatever you decide for your company is great, but you just need to be consistent, and everyone who's contributing to this system needs to be aware of that and keep consistency there too. Another thing with naming, you want to use semantic names and not descriptive names. So instead of using something like shiny indigo button, you'd want to use something more standard like primary button. And this probably will go hand in hand with design, so that helps with that consistency issue as well. All right, so now that we have a name, let's build a component. So here's just a little snippet of one of our button components. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how you would use all this stuff within your app. So each component is just an easy-to-use Ember add-on. So let's say you want to use Ticketfly UI. You would Ember install Ticketfly CSS, and Ember install, let's say, Ember Ticketfly buttons. So again, this would be an app with all our foundation styles and just a bunch of buttons. Okay, so then you have access to those throughout the app. And then your app.css file, you can import whichever pieces from the Ticketfly CSS module that you need. So typography, settings, garnishes, etc. And then you can use those throughout your app. So how do these components work together? So there you've got your Ember app, and then you're really just importing all this stuff. So you've got your CSS, and then, again, whatever components that you're going to need. So in this case, if you have buttons, checkboxes, toasts, those are all accessible now inside your app. Notice they're all at the same major version, so they'll all work together. All right, so then how do components actually work together with all of our apps? I know this slide looks a little insane, so we're going to step through it and go over a little bit. The solid lines are your direct dependencies. And then I'm actually going to focus on the dotted lines here. Those are your peer dependencies, and I mentioned that a little bit earlier as one of the issues. So Ticketfly CSS is delivering the core styles to all of your apps. So that's where they get their foundation styles from. But the components also depend on Ticketfly CSS for their internal styles. So that's where the dependency is, and it's a peer dependency. So when the components and the CSS are installed in the parent app, they're installed alongside each other. So what that means is that the components are going to inherit the Ticketfly CSS from whatever version the parent app is using. And that's why there needs to be that major version agreement. So if Ticketfly CSS is at version 3, but your button's only at version 2, when they both get installed together alongside each other, it's going to inherit from that higher version, and things could break. Okay, so that's why we have that major version agreement. And this is fine as long as that's communicated and everyone's aware of that. But pure dependencies in general, why are they bad? Or if you can avoid them, it's a good idea. So everything is coupled. There's really no opt-in for certain updates. And it's really hard to bump versions. So both for the consuming app and then for the design system, because literally if one thing bumps up, everything else has to go too. So let me go over that a little bit more. So let's say we want to upgrade Toast to version 3. There was a major upgrade. We upgraded Toast. So any app that's using Toast now needs the Ticketfly CSS also to be at that, let's say, version 3. So these are all at version 2, so is Ticketfly CSS. We upgraded Toast. So Ticketfly CSS now also has to be upgraded to version 3. So that'll work for the Toast, the apps that are consuming the Toast. But let's say then that these other apps also are using Ticketfly CSS. That upgraded version has to be at the same version as all these other components. So what that looks like is basically this whole bottom half of the graph all had to be upgraded just because we made an upgrade to Toast, a major upgrade. So that's where the whole design system actually has to be re-released in that new version. So it makes things a lot more complicated. So a way to avoid this. You see there are still a lot of lines, and it's still a little bit of a crazy mess, but there are no dotted lines. There are no more pure dependencies. So if you can actually pre-build your components with the foundation styles baked in, you can take out this pure dependency. So in this case, each component is actually reliant on a specific version of CSS for their internals. You can then pre-compile all this at publish time, deliver a CSS reset style sheet for the component internals themselves, and then we've decoupled the dependency, and you take out that pure dependency entirely. And another thing with best practices, probably engineers' least favorite part of this, but it's the release process. And it's a really important part of the system to keep your system managed and maintained and used. So documentation, we need good documentation on how to use things, if something has been upgraded, different versions, code snippets, all that stuff. Communication strategies. So different companies communicate changes and new features and upgrades in different ways. Some people send out a newsletter. Some people have monthly meetings about this. Some people have a Slack channel. Whatever works best for your company is great, but just make sure that there is a lot of communication around new things and changes. And then support. So in an ideal world, there's a new feature, there's an upgrade, and everything works super easily. There are no issues, no bugs. Everyone's on board with the new thing. But we know that doesn't always happen. So it's really important to have support for teams who do run into issues or find different bugs so that they will want to continue using your system. All right, and then I'm just going to talk about a couple things that are ahead for Ticketfly UI. And some things to kind of think about as if you start building a design system for yourself. So we currently don't have our mobile patterns as part of our pattern library. And so ideally, at some point, we would have all this stuff together. So iOS engineers, front-end engineers have one place to go. Design knows where everything is. So it's all together. And then to work on removing any pure dependencies that we do have in our system. And then the other thing that we will be moving towards, so we currently use icon fonts, which icon fonts are pretty cool. They're vectors, and you can change the CSS on the fly. But let's say we want to make the outside of that star icon gray and the inside indigo. You can't do that. Okay, so I don't want any of those fancy colors anyway, but let's say I want to hover over something and make just part of that icon move. you can't do that either. So there are some limitations with icon fonts. So we've already had discussions about moving this way in the future, going toward SVGs. So they're pretty amazing. As you can see, so SVGs have custom styling, CSS animations, CSS interactions. They're also scalable and resolution independent. You have solid browser support, and then they're basically accessible by default because they're really just markup. So if you're already on the SVG train, then it's a good place to be because they allow you for a lot of things that icon fonts and other image file sizes don't allow. Okay, so that brings us kind of to the end of my talk, and I wanted to leave you with just a few things as you go into the rest of Ember Conference for the next 2.5 days. Basically, the goals that you have here for why you're building this design system. A main thing here is we want to enable usability, and I mentioned this before. If you're building a system that's hard to use or hard to migrate to, then developers and teams aren't really going to want to use it, and it's going to die out. We want to create components that are easy to upgrade and not break all their different apps. And then ultimately, you really want to make this system a part of your culture. So this enables long-term adoption, maintenance, and use. And a lot of companies, actually some that I talked to, they had made it so much a part of their culture that there actually is now a designated team that is focused on creating and maintaining, upgrading these features and support around that. So that's how you know you've really made it when you have that team, and it's a part of your company's culture. And that's it. Any questions?